Welcome students. Now we will see what are the characteristics of labor. This chapter picturizes the characters of labor in general and in India in particular. In each nation, the workers share the national culture, but this does not make them different as human beings or as industrial workers. Certain peculiarities may distinguish them from others, but the traits in which they agree with the rest place them in the same category. The early industrial workers. The introduction of the new mechanical methods of production drove out of the market the native craftsmen who were replaced in the cities by a mass of poor laborers, unskilled, unorganized and torn away by need from their homes. Receiving very poor wages in exchange for long hours of work under the most insalubrious conditions, they lived in squalid quarters or slums with their women and children who shared with them their work and mode of life under similar conditions. Not only the material conditions, but also the outlook and philosophy were also changed. In the unregulated factories, the labor conditions were unbearable. Traditional workers in general are more concerned with job security, stability and clear direction. They feel that an employer is responsible for providing a clear career path and in return deserves an employee's long-term commitment. The early industrial workers were exploited and became poverty-ridden. At the same time, a rise in the standard of living is observed in new industrial period. The tendency of new industrial workers are quite different. They demand not only economic security, but also social security to improve his status in society. They aspire satisfactory working environments and the social relations which bind them to their fellow workers. The modern worker has a definite preference for factory employment, but also developed a priority scale of expectations in the job. At the same time, to improve his prospect, he acquires skills and training. The factory system is unable to provide for the economic security and social needs which the caste and village community supplied. They will continue to retain their psychological and social ties with the village, retarding thereby the development of the mental attitudes that industry and the new order require. The modern worker. Today, the industrial labor force presents to the observer is not an incoherent crowd in an amorphous system, but of a class distinct and organized, constituting an important and certainly the most numerous part of the occupational structure of society. Management, on the other hand, is no longer reduced to the individual or family firm where the owner is everything and the rest are nothing or substitutes. Considering as a whole the levels and categories engaged in modern Indian industry from the point of view of their occupational status and social prestige, the following levels could be distinguished. The highest level, which is occupied by the directors and executives. This sector is the most reduced in numbers. The next level is that of the departmental work managers, middle management as well as first and even second class technicians. The third level is made up of junior managers, supervisors and junior superintendents, service officials, higher office employees, etc. Next to these, the skilled workers follow, especially those trained in technical schools and undergraduate centers. Though these are logically classified as blue collar workers, they in fact may be considered as the blue collar aristocracy. This level is made up of office workers employed in industry or in some of its subsidiary activities such as banks, commerce, insurance, etc. These are the so called white collar workers who are now in the process of growth. The last level is filled by manual workers, the authentic blue collar workers to be found everywhere on the basis of modern industry. As India is concerned, this level is divided into two sections. The one is composed of those working in traditional industries, example jute and cotton textiles, mining and plantations. The other is made up of workers employed in modern industries like plastics, chemicals, electronics, etc. At the base of the pyramid, there lies a vast population of agricultural workers and others coming from various sectors who tend to feed and even increase the available real or potential working population, especially of the traditional type. Features of industrial labour. Industrial labour in India has exhibited certain unique features which have affected the trade union movement and industrial relations. These features have been discussed below. Rural background. A vast majority of industrial workers have their roots in villages. Quite a large number of them have left their traditional occupations and have migrated to the cities in search of permanent or temporary employment. Most of them still retain their attachment to land. The periodic migration from the town to the village is a common characteristic without roots in rural area is emerging in the industrial towns and cities. Low level of literacy. As per 1991 census, 52.11% of the Indian population was literate, and this hard reality is reflected in the industrial labour also. The general level of education of workers is far from satisfactory. As a result, they do not understand the problems which their industries confront and the problems which they themselves are facing. This is also one of the factors for weak trade union organizations in India. Predominance of male workers. There has been a predominance of male workers in the Indian workforce. As per 1991 census, male workers constituted 51.52% of male population, whereas only 22.30% of the female population were workers. The number of women workers, which was 14.22 million in 1971, rose to 19.67 million in 1981 and further shot up to 22.7 million in 1991. This shows that more and more women are taking to industrial jobs. Heterogeneity of workforce. The industrial working class has not been a homogeneous class, as people of different castes, communities, ethnic groups, religious beliefs, speaking different languages and coming from different regions work in factories or industrial establishments where everyone finds the other a total stranger. It is difficult for them to confide in their fellow workers. The result is that the Indian labour force is sharply divided between high class and low class, skilled and unskilled, southerner and northerner, etc. This artificial division of working class has affected its collective bargaining capacity. With increased regionalism and parochialism coupled with politicization or unionism, the situation is getting worse than what it was before. Lack of unity. Industrial labour in India is not united, but is divided and subdivided on the basis of religion, region, language and caste. It is only in recent years that some of these differences are disappearing gradually and some degree of unity on the basis of economic consideration is taking place. High rates of absenteeism and labour turnover. Indian workers are in the habit of abstaining from work and have a greater tendency to change their jobs in comparison to workers of other countries. The rates of absenteeism and labour turnover vary from state to state. The rate of absenteeism was highest in Maharashtra, whereas rate of separation or turnover was highest in Uttar Pradesh. The higher rates of absenteeism and labour turnover may be because the workers were originally from the rural areas where people are comparatively free, or it may be because of their lack of education and love of leisure. Migratory character. Another notable feature of industrial labour in India has been its migratory character, indicating that a majority of the workers are immigrants from the rural areas who maintain their connections with their rural homes. They visit their village as frequently as possible because the village is an infinitely better place than the city for the young and the aged, the maimed and the exhausted, the unemployed and the unemployable. The instability of labour commitment to industry adversely and even weaken the trade union movement. Claim to dignity. Another feature that makes factory workers in regular employment a special category is the fact that they have amalgamated into trade unions to care for their own interests and to defend the rights that they have gained with so much difficulty. Government also played an important role in this respect. Labour legislation that was introduced after independence consists largely of regulations intended for fairly small upper layer of the working population. Sources of labour supply. Compelled by necessity, pressed by poverty, hunger or debt, they were driven to leave the villages of their birth, where their ancestors had been born and grown up, to precariously settled in the towns where nothing was congenial. Others also followed suit because their occupations as village blacksmiths or carpenters could not stand the competition from the cities, and thus joined as labourers the very forces that had defeated them as masters. In some cases, they wanted to shake off once for all the caste disabilities of the village by getting submerged into the anonymity of the city, while others finally took refuge in the metropolis to escape perhaps the arm of justice and get themselves lost among the uniform crowds of the dispossessed. Labourer in the cities availed himself of every opportunity to rush back to the village as frequently as possible to visit his parents, wife or children, and to breathe the air of the place where he expected to spend his life peacefully. As the current sentence runs, he was pushed to not pulled by the city, because at any rate he still was a villager at heart. But together with the industrial development of the country and owing mostly to labour legislation, public opinion and other factors, the condition of the industrial labourers improved while their numbers were also growing. The overwhelming majority of the working population in India still remains agriculturalist. India's urban population has doubled from 109 millions to 218 millions during the last 2 decades and is estimated to reach 320 millions by 2020 AD. The proportion of people in developing countries who live in cities has almost doubled since 1960, from less than 22% to more than 40%, while in more developed countries the urban share has grown from 61% to 76%. Urbanization is projected to continue. By 2030, it is expected that nearly 5 billion, 61% of the worker population of 8.1 billion will live in cities. India shares this global trend. Characteristics of Indian labour. Since independence, Indian labour force have considerably changed. Though migratory labour is still coming to the cities, yet most of the industrial labour in them is city born. This is not the case with the industrial colonies or townships recently opened in various parts of India, where the vast majority of the labourers have migrated from villages or rural centres. So, concerning the big cities where most of the industrial workers are settled, it can no longer be said that he is a villager at heart or that he is pushed or pulled to the city. It is true that more often than not the labourer still visits his village where his parents or relatives may be or may attend religious ceremonies which are customarily held in the village of origin. But it does not mean that he desires to live in it or even to retire to it in his old age. The so called village nexus is now far weaker than the early literature on the subject implied. Historical evidence indicates that the transformation of a rural traditional population into a committed industrial labour force has not been socially difficult in India. The desperate poverty of the countryside made available a large labour supply that was eager to move into industry as opportunity appeared. Once employed in the factories, the workers on the whole readily adjusted to the disciplinary requirements of mechanized industry. Yet, in the light of more recent events, this view seems to be too optimistic. It is true that the ancestral connection with the village has to a great extent been broken, but other types of connections with it and other practices leading to absenteeism have appeared, some of them quite paradoxically due to an improvement in the economic situation. Thus, according to a recent report, the periodical exodus of the workers to their native places has continued to plague the industry with mounting absenteeism. In recent years, the problem of absenteeism has assumed considerable magnitude due to the increased tendency to avail of leisure with the improvement of earning. Thus, moonlighting, land cultivation in the native place illicit distillation and other such activities in urban areas have contributed to this increase of absenteeism. Only during the period 1960 to 65, in the cotton mills of Bombay, the increase was from 10.5% to 18.4%, and in Coimbatore from 11.5% to 13.1%. Similar figures from various parts of India apply also to engineering concerns and others. Though the rise in absenteeism is not so steep, in spite of these drawbacks, which are not unknown in more industrially developed countries, it must be acknowledged that a genuine industrial laboring population with modern characteristics of its own is being formed in India. It does not coincide with the classical proletariat of Karl Marx, which was phenomenon peculiar of Western capitalism at its rise, nor is it similar to the labor force of the modern industrial town, which is an answer to the social demands of the period. Yet it is a real laboring population with its own features, which is contributing to shaping of modern India. Traditional and modern workers. This labor force is by no means uniform. It may clearly be divided into two parts: traditional industrial workers and modern industrial workers, as expressed in the occupational pyramid. The traditional industrial workers are mostly represented by the textile workers, especially of the cotton and jute industries, while the modern industrial workers are typically represented by such new industries, example chemical, plastics, mechanical, etc. This distinction is more necessary in India than in the Western industrialized countries. Here, owing to the traditional connection between occupation and caste, the endogamy, which is characteristic of the latter, tends also to generate a kind of endogamy of occupation or endofunction, by which this becomes perpetuated in the group. Thus, a sweeper in a Western modern factory could be classified as modern worker, and his children will ordinarily take to other and probably higher occupation, but not so in India at the present stage, where his children will be in all likelihood remain sweepers or coolies. Things in this respect are changing, but traditions die hard. The characteristic feature of the modern industrial workers is that they are generally younger, more literate, better educated, more skilled and better paid than traditional industrial workers, though there are exceptions. The modern industrial workers are oriented towards cosmopolitanism and modernity, while their counterparts are more rooted in kinship and sectionalism. The former represent the forces of progress, the latter those of tradition. The range of functional differentiation in the former is far wider than that of the latter. Modern industrial workers are more capable of concrete action and organization than the other, and their ties with industry are more based on contract and choice than on caste and inheritance. They are not only more individualistic and active, but also more amenable to association and intelligent collaboration, so that the trade unionism comes more easily to them than to the others. In a word, they show the traits which correspond to the industrial worker in every modern society. This does not mean that the modern industrial workers are exclusively confined to only one type of industry and the traditional industrial workers to another. There is a certain amount of mixture represented mostly by the skilled or clerical workers employed in the traditional industries, the janitors or cleaners and others serving a lower occupations who may engage in modern. While the former are clearly modern workers, the latter may be considered as isolated islands of tradition surrounded by the sea of progress. Literacy and education. A characteristic difference existing between these two types of workers is literacy and education. Broadly speaking, 1/3 of the male workforce and 2/3 of the female workforce are found illiterate at the national level. It also very encouraging to note that nearly 1/4 of the male workforce have educational level above metric. This figure is only 1/10 of the female workforce. Work orientation. The affluent worker is the orientation of the employee towards his work as a resultant of his definition of the working situation. The definition and orientation are made up of elements operating or acquired outside the working place such as tradition, social structure, collective interests, etc. In other words, the orientation of the worker towards his work seems to be largely decided by factors external to the work situation. The Indian worker therefore is no exception to this role, and as such when he joins the factory he has already been exposed to a definite type of upbringing, social tradition and mental habits. Thus, the Indian male born and bred in the traditional joint family and shaped up in it up to the time he marries is liable to become handicapped for the rest of his life by the overprotectiveness and consequent sense of difference inbuilt in him during his childhood. To the action of his family, he has to add the influence of his caste or biradari, his caste immediate group, all of which act as a shock absorber or a security to soften the adversities of life. Besides this, there is also the paternalistic attitude of the head of the family, whose prolonged exercise of power services only to blunt the child's sense of responsibility and self-assertion. Hence, when the grown-up boy or adult is confronted with the realities of a modern industrial world with its strain and stresses, its competition and conflict, he is liable to become a prey to despondency and insecurity, unconsciously developing what is known as the mob-up attitude towards his superiors, whereby he may become a submissive servant as well as a lazy worker. These attitudes, which would be natural in a feudal society, are incompatible with the progressive industrial democracy. Summary. The characteristics of labor was analyzed. What has been observed about industrial workers in general can also be applied to India. Cottage industries were not able to compete with the modern industries. So, the laborers moved from villages to cities. These traditional industrial workers were more conservative, influenced by the forces of tradition, recruited from rural and remained more attached to them. On the other hand, socially shaped modern industrial workers were younger, better educated and progressive. Absenteeism reduced, and at the same time commitment was also not in full swing. Though the modern tendencies of equality, individualism and reliance on merit entered in industry, the traditional forces like casteism are at force. However, it is believed by the scholars that the Indian worker will be incorporated in industrial life as an active and conscious member is possible.